At a local auction, I won a couple of lift stands. While they're both fully functional, and the finish just really isn't all that great. So today I'm going to take one of them and refinish it. This is giving me an opportunity to try out two new paint types that I've never used before: epoxy primer and acrylic enamel finish. Hi, I'm Paul, and this is Adventures in Fabrication. If it's your first time here, be sure and hit that subscribe button and the bell notification so you don't miss out on future videos. First step in the process was disassembling the lift stand. Really came about pretty easy. It was just undoing a bunch of nuts and bolts. Now once I did get it apart, I chose not to take apart the hydraulic cylinder. I felt that was working fine, and to just take it apart to get into an area behind the spring to paint that was just more risk than it was worth. The process I used to strip the paint was paint on citrus strip, then wrap it in plastic wrap, leave it overnight, then scrape it off with a scraper. Then leave it to dry and bring in the grinder with wire wheel and wire brush and sander to remove the remaining paint. For the painting process, I started off by cleaning up all the parts with Prep-All to remove the oil and grease that was put on it. After that was removed, I primed it with an epoxy primer from Shopline. After that, I used an acrylic enamel from Shopline. For the smaller parts, however, I chose to use a black DMT from Benjamin Moore. Now into the painting. Here I'm mixing up the epoxy primer. It has a lot of solids in it. It took about 5 minutes of serious stirring to get it all mixed up. I then poured the primer into a standard mixing cup and mixed in hardener at a ratio of 4:1. After you mix it in the hardener, you let it sit for about 15 minutes to let it all settle and start the hardening process. Then I poured it through a strainer into a Harbor Freight paint gun. That's a full-size paint gun that I got for $9. Here you can see that a full-size paint gun is just a little bit overkill for this type of project. I was getting a lot of overspray. Of course, it really didn't help that when I set up the booth, I kind of screwed up and had the fan in backwards, and instead of sucking air out, it was blowing air in. But it was still a lot more paint gun than I needed for the job and something this size. I need to see if I can find a small touch-up gun that's capable of shooting epoxy primer or something with maybe a 1.4 tip. One of the other problems I had was I tried to set everything up for filming, and what I realized later was it would have been much better to break the project into two parts and just did the tops and bottom parts in one session and then doing the support posts in another. I could have spread things out a little bit more. It would have been much easier. I think I would have gotten better results by doing that. But in general, spraying epoxy was pretty easy. There wasn't anything really tricky about it. It went on fairly easily. Didn't have any problems there with it. One of the other interesting things is that I found is shooting things on the ground is a lot more difficult than it looks. It's much easier if you can get them hanging. Again, if I could have separated it into two different sessions, I would have been able to hang the parts up and would have been able to paint them that way. Much easier. Here you see me mixing the acrylic enamel final coat or base coat. It's a single stage, so there's no clear needed. The hardest part of the process is pouring out the paint. Pouring out a full 1-gallon paint into a small container is a little more difficult than it looks, and I need to figure out a better way. You mix about 15 parts paint to 1 part catalyst, and then you strain it and put it in the gun. Here I'm using the Devilbiss SRIPRO. It's a spot repair gun. It requires about 3.5 CFM. My little 2-horse compressor had really no problem supporting it and getting it done. Again, notice how little overspray there is compared to shooting with the Harbor Freight gun. You can hardly see the overspray, and if I would have had the fan turn around the right way, it would have been even less obvious. And this is where the challenge really became space. Getting the right distance to get the right atomization is critical when spraying paint, or you get things like orange peel on it. And I did get on the larger, flatter surfaces of those plates some orange peel that was caused by putting on just a little bit too much paint from being too close at a little bit too low a pressure. I think part of the pressure problem was that I had that, you can see it on the gun, that little red filter. I'm not sure at this point that it does any good. After I was done and trying to figure out why I got the orange peel, I cut open that filter and found out that I had absolutely 0 water trapped in it, and it has a bunch of little cloth pieces in it, and those cloth pieces were still pristine. So it wasn't really doing anything that I could figure, except blocking the flow of air or reducing possibly the air pressure at the nozzle. Here you see me spraying a couple of small parts. I was using an accent color of black and using the DMT paint with the Iwata RG3 paint gun. The RG3 only requires about 1.1 CFM of air. The compressor came on, I think, once through the whole process, and I'm not sure that that was even due to the painting, and that was through 2 coats of paint. You'll notice that there's very little overspray with this. For these types of small parts, this may be the ideal gun. It puts out about a 3-inch round pattern and uses hardly any paint. I used between 1 ounce and 1.5 ounces of paint in the gun, and I threw out a good portion of that when I was done. Here you see assembly. Again, it was just putting a bunch of nuts and bolts back together, and that really wasn't too much effort. The only challenge was getting the 3 posts aligned. This whole lift stand was handmade, so it required some shimming to get those posts aligned. There were shims in it when I took it apart, and I did mark where they were, but it needed some additional shimming because the original paint job was just a base coat on there, and I put a base plus epoxy, which made the specs between posts tighter. In summary, I'm really pleased how the project turned out. It's the first time I've ever picked a color off a color chip that I actually like when the project's done. I learned a lot about spray painting. I learned that epoxy primer really isn't difficult to shoot. Go ahead and use it if you can. Acrylic enamel, pretty easy to shoot. The other big thing I learned is make sure you try not to do too much in too small a space. That can affect the finish. And next time I'll, if necessary, take more time to do the project by breaking it up into more steps. Now before you go, be sure and hit the subscribe button and share this video. Thanks for watching.